Hello everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to the RUC Eminent Person Lecture event. We are happy of having the honor of welcoming Ms. Melissa Fleming, UN Undersecretary General for Global Communication, who will share with us an insight on the 80 years of the UN, multilateralism, and the fight for human rights. Thank you, Melissa, for coming to the RUC. With us is also our Director General, Professor Ivan Šimonović, participants of our long-standing course, Diversity of Human Rights, also participants of other programs from Dubrovnik and citizens of Dubrovnik. So thank you all for coming. Melissa's lecture would take approximately 20 minutes, but afterwards we plan to have an open floor for the discussion. So you're all invited to ask questions, and we are asking our Professor Anna Matan to moderate the discussion afterwards. And after this event, we are inviting you all for the reception in the courtyard. So now I would like to invite Professor Šimonović to greet you all, introduce Ms. Fleming.
Thank you very much, Nada. Melissa, it's wonderful to have you here. It's a unique opportunity to combine participants of a course dealing with diversity of human rights and a UN champion of global communications, communicating, among other issues, what the UN does for human rights issues. I think that the theme of Melissa's presentation, multilateralism and human rights, cannot be more timely. UN and the world are facing challenges both to multilateralism and human rights. And being in charge of global communications of the United Nations, Melissa is uniquely positioned to understand both global challenges, the activities of the United Nations to overcome these challenges, and the environment in which the UN operates. And Melissa, I believe you joined the United Nations in 2019.
I think I believe I joined the United Nations
yes, in this capacity.
In this capacity, yeah,
before. And it's also an opportunity for you to assess trends since you joined the Secretariat and since you were in charge of global communications. Melissa is an outstanding person with a very high reputation as a journalist, as an author, and as UN high-level officials. So without further ado, I would pass the floor to Melissa to say us something about strengths and weaknesses of the United Nations and opportunities and threats to its operations in the current environment. Melissa, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your comments and event. Thank you, Ambassador Šimonović. It's really good to see you again in this capacity and in your home country and in this beautiful city. And thank you very much, Nada, also for inviting me. I'm going to, you gave me quite a nice introduction with lots of different titles, and you raised all of your expectations. Some people call me the chief storyteller of the United Nations. And so I'm going to start with a story that is related to Dubrovnik. On December 6th, 1991, a 23-year-old photographer named Pavo Orban took his last photographs. just very close to here. And for 2 months, he'd been risking his life documenting the shelling of Dubrovnik, capturing the explosions, the billowing smoke. He captured burning cars and ships and people running for their lives. He's also captured the terrible destruction, as well as some symbols of human life in war. One of the photos showed, for example, an old woman who was reading names of the dead stuck to a wall. I learned about him yesterday when my husband and I took a tour of the old city of Dubrovnik, and we had a wonderful guide, thanks to the IUC, a historian herself, and she showed us the stone that was dedicated to his memory with his name engraved on a wall near the old harbor. And she also said that he was defending Dubrovnik with his camera. This motivated us to visit just down the street the end of Yugoslav war photo exhibit. It was just a few blocks away. And there, I don't have, how many of you have been there? None of you yet. I really recommend it. We saw a stirring collection of photos that also ask us to face the horrors of war. There's an exhibit about Myanmar, but there's also an exhibit of what happened in Yugoslavia. Because what it does is it does document the horrors of war so that we understand how horrific and what a nightmare it is. But it also honors the courage of those who document it and our collective responsibility to work for peace. So, dear friends, the UN Charter, which is our founding treaty, I would say in this context is as vital today as it was during its signing 80 years ago. And I just want to remind you of some of the key passages, because they're passages that we recite over and over to just keep us focused. First of all, the mission of the United Nations must be to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. The scourge of war that we experienced here in the former Yugoslavia. It also calls for the respect for the dignity and the worth of the human person in the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small. It also calls on us to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained. But also it calls on us to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. In 1954, the second Secretary General of the United Nations, Dag Hammarskjöld, said, "The United Nations was not created in order to bring us to heaven, but to save us from hell." Less than 40 years later, with the outbreak of the Yugoslav war, people here were living through hell. And the UN was called upon to act. Peacekeepers arrived to try to hold fragile ceasefires, to separate the warring forces, and to protect civilians caught between them. In Eastern Slavonia, the UN even governed directly for a time, and so that bitterly divided territory could be peacefully reintegrated into Croatia. But the UN's role was never only about the blue helmets, as they're called. Back to the Charter, it was about human dignity, the dignity and the worth of the human person. So as villages were being emptied, cities besieged, and families displaced, UN agencies worked on the front line of suffering, bringing food and shelter and medicine to those in need. And here in Dubrovnik, when this ancient city was under siege, and we learned also yesterday that the electricity was cut off, the water supply was cut off, UN convoys carried supplies across dangerous front lines. And they did more than just deliver aid. They delivered a message that the world was watching, and that this city, a jewel of world heritage, would not be abandoned. Through the International Criminal Tribunal, the United Nations made clear that war crimes must be met with justice and not with silence. And when the guns finally fell silent, the United Nations stayed. It shifted from emergency to recovery, rebuilding homes and schools, helping refugees to return, supporting reconciliation, and clearing the landmines that scarred the Croatian soil. And that work helped to open a path for Croatia from war to peace, from devastation to Croatia's place in the European Union. And I have to say, since joining the UN in 1992, Croatia has gone from a nation needing peacekeepers to a nation contributing peacekeepers, sending us armed forces, police, and diplomats to UN missions worldwide, and including, of course, my neighbor to the United Nations in New York, I believe 2 times. You served there.
Serious case of precedentism.
Yes. So for 33 years, Croatia, a small country, yes, but a country that has stood with us as a champion of a rules-based international order based on the Charter of the United Nations. So the UN story in Croatia and here in Dubrovnik is one of protection, of justice, of compassion, and recovery. But it's a reminder that even in the darkest moments, the world can come together in the service of peace. And it is here, also in Dubrovnik, that we see how a city once under siege stands as a symbol of renewal. It is, as you know, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and I'm proud to say that UNESCO is a UN organization, and that UNESCO did a lot to help in the restoration, and still to this day, of Dubrovnik. But it is also a reminder that peace is not only possible, but it's also enduring. It can be. But the peace that proved possible here in Croatia feels very distant in many parts of the world today. In Gaza, 90% of the strip has been destroyed, and more than 63,000 lives have been lost, and famine has set in. In Ukraine, where more civilians are dying now than any time since the war began. And in Sudan, where we see mass displacement, starvation, and sexual violence, making this one of the world's worst worst humanitarian crises of this century. There are 120 conflicts in the world today. That's more than any time since 1945. And they're different in their nature. They're deadlier, they are messier, and they're more lawless. We're seeing civilians are targets. Hospitals, schools, cafes are being bombarded, and starvation and rape are being used as weapons of war. We're also seeing record numbers of journalists being killed, and many of them deliberately. We're seeing many in the UN family being killed. In fact, last year was the deadliest year for United Nations workers in our own history. But this is not just about war zones. This is also a dark time for human rights. Across the world, authoritarian leaders silence the media, they crush the opposition, they scapegoat minorities, and they strip women and girls of their rights. The most egregious example of that is in Afghanistan. And add to this the climate crisis, which at its core is also a human rights crisis. Here in Croatia and across the Mediterranean, heat waves are growing longer and harsher, and floods are devastating. Droughts are disrupting agriculture, and tourism is suffering in sweltering summers. So this is not a series of isolated shocks either. It is a global bonfire, an all-out assault on our humanity and our environment, on our rights, on international law, on the very institutions built to protect them. And if I haven't depressed you enough, I'm just going to add one more aspect before giving you some hope. We are living in a toxic information environment, an information environment that is fueling this fire. We once believed, and as somebody who heads communications, I remember at one time being very excited about social media coming onto the scene as a way to engage people directly. We saw that it can connect people, it can spread solutions, and it can give voice to the voiceless. However, the algorithms are designed in a way that makes and rewards outrage. It rewards lies. In fact, there was an MIT study that concluded that lies travel 6 times faster than facts. Hate is amplified. And people, of course, there are always scapegoats. And on social media, the scapegoats are refugees who are being demonized, women, especially women in leadership positions, or activists or journalists are being silenced, and climate activists are being bullied. The UN found also that in Myanmar, Facebook actually fueled a genocide. So today, what we're seeing is that UN aid agencies and also our peacekeepers are being targeted by disinformation campaigns that are putting our staff at risk. And the harm is enormous. We're finding that it is slowing down climate action. It is also fueling violence, and it, most importantly, is eroding trust, our trust, society's trust in facts, in science, and in the very idea of truth. So at the start of our 80th anniversary, the UN is also facing some other very big challenges. Funding cuts have hit the UN very hard. I think you've probably heard that the United States, that was once the backbone of our humanitarian system, that provided as much as 40% of the funding of many of our humanitarian organizations, has pulled back and has suddenly stopped the funding. And this has meant that programs fighting HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, and cholera were slashed. Organizations like UNHCR, where I served for 10 years, the International Organization for Migration, the World Food Program, UNICEF, the World Health Organization, have all been have been forced to cut thousands of staff and programs. And the consequences are more devastating. What that means is in the theaters and in the places they were serving, we are already seeing a dramatic rise in suffering, in hunger. And also, as a consequence, we expect more instability and also more migration. But funding for us at the UN is not the only obstacle. And back to Gaza, I think one of the most painful things for us is that food and medicine sit just kilometers from starving people in our trucks, where we're unable to provide the access that we would like to and that we know that we could because we were doing it before. It remains blocked at the border. And in Sudan, there is also a terrible siege around Al-Fashir that is preventing us from delivering aid. Famine was also declared there. And the conclusion is that when access is denied, people are dying. So this is the world we are navigating right now. We're seeing a disintegration of large parts of our aid architecture, the trampling of human rights and international law, and the unraveling of global norms. But I promise to tell you there is some hope. There's always hope. And last year, for example, the United Nations at the General Assembly, 193 nations against all odds agreed to 3 historic documents. One is called the Pact for the Future, and it's our most ambitious document to renew and reform the United Nations, including the Security Council, including the international financial architecture that we've had in decades. We also have a global digital compact, which is the first framework for AI and online safety, a declaration on future generations, which pledges to protect the people and generations yet to come. We also launched, and I was happy to be one of the authors of this, the Global Principles on Information Integrity of the United Nations, which is a roadmap to reclaim our information space and make it healthy. So as the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, keeps reminding us, he's saying, I am not optimistic, I am not pessimistic, I am determined. And he asked us to do 3 things, those of us working for the UN at the Secretariat, and that is to defend multilateralism. We know that we cannot solve any of the problems I outlined at the beginning of this talk unless we come together and work on them together. Stick to our principles, the values enshrined in the Charter, and do not backslide. And seize opportunities. There are always opportunities. And in that gesture, he also introduced another initiative called the UN 80 Initiative. And this is to look at the UN and how we operate. We know that we have shrinking resources. We know that we're under attack. How can we reform to survive this? It's pretty existential, but how can we end up doing more with less and doing it well? So our resources are shrinking, but our determination has not. And even in these dark moments, we believe that the world can come together in the service of peace and is coming together in the arena of the United Nations. But lastly, I'd just like to say, we need you. Human rights are not upheld by institutions alone. They are upheld by people, by you, by students, by academics, professors, and also citizens. You are also, not just learning about your own rights, but the rights that are enshrined in international law that belong to you. And you are their guardians too. So even when the odds are against us, progress is possible. For example, just last month, another UN body, the International Court of Justice, declared that governments have a legal duty to protect the climate, and that people, we all have a right to a healthy environment. And that case that was brought to the International Court of Justice was not brought by statesmen or any governments. It was brought by young Pacific Islanders. So that is proof also that the next generation is pushing us forward in a positive direction. So I'd just like to also say that we're seeing a shift too. When things feel like they're backsliding and turning dark, we're seeing more and more people turn to the United Nations. Again, I run our social media accounts. We have 60 million followers of UN accounts on social media. And I remember it was International Women's Day in March this year, where every year we go to the General Assembly and the Secretary General gets up and speaks. And his speech, even though we were being told, not to promote gender equality as much anymore, he gave a rousing speech to the General Assembly. He warned that misogyny was going mainstream, but his message that we clipped and put out there on calling for protection of women's rights, it was amplified by young people and became his most popular social media post ever to this day. We saw actually millions of people turn to us and thousands of new followers come to us. That's just one example. Also, there was a recent global poll that showed that nearly 90% of people around the world want stronger climate action, even at their own personal cost, even if they would have to pay, for example, 1% of their own salary. We're also seeing a big shift in public opinion on Gaza that is demanding a ceasefire, that is demanding that the UN have humanitarian access to stop and reverse the famine, and as well continuing to call for a return of the hostages. We are also seeing that the public still believes in the United Nations, even when the member states that sometimes, sometimes fail to stop the wars and the misery and the suffering that we all expect of it. So let me close now with the words of the founder of this great institution, Ivan Supek, who is also a philosopher. He said, "A good person cannot be happy when their neighbor, even if far away, lives in poverty and suffers injustice." And he called on us to develop a culture of peace. He said, "This is the hope for the ultimate resolution of a global nuclear, ecological, and ideologic religious powder keg, in which even being inactive is deadly." Even being inactive is deadly. I see this as a call to action. We must heed that warning that being inactive is deadly. We should not be passive at this moment. Let us choose to speak up. Let us choose compassion, and let us build a culture of peace. Thank you very much.